Okay, it's done. So I want to speak in Spanish, okay? Because it's just on stuff, and I think it's better if I say that language. Ok, muy buenas tardes con todas y con todos. El día de hoy tenemos nuestra sesión de clausura del curso conjunto, del primer curso internacional en Derecho y Economía, organizado entre la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador, con el apoyo y respaldo de la Universidad Externada de Colombia, y asimismo la Asociación Latinoamericana e Ibérica de Análisis Económico del Derecho y Economía. En esta sesión contaremos con la participación de la profesora Santonini, cuya presentación estará a cargo de mi colega, el profesor Juan Martín Morando, y del profesor Michael Gilbert. Se les recuerda que cada presentación tendrá una duración establecida de 20 minutos. No question and answers no ha sido considerada, la sección de preguntas y respuestas, perdón, no ha sido considerada. Entonces esperamos que los expositores tengan toda la libertad para plantear sus ideas de forma expedita. Y bueno, profesora Flavia, muchísimas gracias por haber encontrado un espacio en su agenda para compartir con nosotros. Juan Martín, te cedo la palabra.
Sí. Bien, muchas gracias, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias, profesora Flavia. Primero voy a hacer la presentación en español y luego nos volveremos hacia el inglés definitivamente. Bien, la profesora Flavia Vera es postdoctora, ha hecho un postdoctorado en la Universidad de Columbia en New York en 2019, fue becaria postdoctoral en el Centro Internacional de Investigaciones Económicas en Turín, en Italia. También ha hecho estudios postdoctorales en el Instituto de Derecho y Economía de la Universidad de Hamburgo en Alemania. Fue profesora invitada del programa Erasmus, tiene una maestría y un doctorado en Derecho por la Universidad de California en Berkeley, con especial rotación en Derecho y Economía. Originalmente la profesora Flavia fue licenciada en Economía y licenciada en Derecho por la Universidad de Brasilia, profesor de la maestría y graduación en Derecho del Instituto Brasilense de Direito Público, perdón por la pronunciación, investigador y profesor del posgrado de Análisis Económico del Derecho del mencionado instituto, presidente durante un periodo de la asociación, durante 2 periodos de la Asociación Iberoamericana e Ibérica de Derecho y Economía, periodo 2007 y 2012-2014, ha sido fundadora de la Asociación Brasileña de Derecho y Economía en 2007, ha sido analista legislativo en el Senado Federal desde 1985, trabajando en el capítulo de Finanzas Públicas de la Asamblea Constituyente de 1988, ha trabajado en el Centro de Estudios e Investigaciones de la Asesoría Legislativa, ha sido profesor en el Instituto Legislativo Brasileño, ha servido en la Comisión Mixta del Presupuesto, ha sido asesora de senadores como Nelson Carneiro y Jarbas Pasariño, y también trabajó en un bufete de abogados en el Senado Federal. También es miembro de la Sociedad Montpellier y ha hecho participaciones activas en Liberty Fund, además de ser mediadora judicial. I'm so sorry, because I think I took almost 18 of your 20 minutes reading your resume. So I'm so sorry. Thank you to be here with us, Professor Flavia. It's a pleasure and privilege to have you with us. So if you want to, you can begin.
Thank you, Rubens. Can you all hear me well? Thank you for everything. You didn't need to say all that. Oh my gosh, I feel old. Well, anyway, it's a pleasure and honor to be here, and mi español no es muy bueno, es un portuñol, entonces tal vez sea mejor en inglés. So, I'm gonna try to be really practical, really quick. And I first started as an economist, and I worked in Congress at the CRS, Congressional Research Service, kind of like equivalent in Brazil. And I worked with public policy, and I started working with budget. And I was an economist. I passed an entrance exam. I worked in the Constitution and 1988, and everything was about law. It was like law was the status, the big thing. Economist, nobody cared. They call lawyers doctor here. Economist is nothing. I got a master in governmental budgeting at FGV, and I continued to be nothing, an advisor, but it didn't have the status. And I worked at a legislative branch. So I was like, I need to learn law. So I passed the entrance exam to the University of Brasilia again, and I went to law school 5 years. I think just like it is in Ecuador. In the United States, it's a 3-year JD program. In Brazil, it's a bachelor again to the university. And after I threw my cap up in the commencement, the graduation, Dr. Flavia, I was like, now I'm a doctor. And so law was very important. But I had a mindset of an economist, a person that asks questions. Why do you want to allocate this budget to this program? Why do you want to do this? So I worked with politicians, and I knew the distance, the difference, the gap between being a technician, an advisor, and they being a public policy maker, a politician, a decision maker. So I give advice, the technical part, they do the politics, and that was totally different. I would maybe advise them to do A, B, C, and they would do D, E, F, different, okay? So learned what I had an eye on the law, and I had an eye on what they wanted to do. And many times they didn't show what they wanted to do. They were like disguising. I want to help the unions, but I want to say that I want to help the reduce accidents in the streets with truck drivers. So I was like, I want to reduce agency problem. So I want you to be honest on what you're going to do. Okay, so this was my life in practice. My academic life was building law and economics. I started with economics. I went to law. I wanted to do something that combined, and I only knew competition law, competencia, antitrust. I didn't know anything else in the legal universe that used economics. So I decided to start in competition law, to use my background that converged. I didn't know law and economics. I applied to Berkeley. My first class was law and economics with Robert Cooter. I fell in love. He is charming. And I was like, my gosh, this makes sense. So this word, this sentence, it makes sense, is what this talk is about. It makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to share my slides, and I'm going to try to be quick. Okay, can you see the slides? All right. So if you go back, economics, as we know, this field of study is very, right? Law, like mathematics, is very old. So you're asking me to combine law and economics. Well, economics, you have a background, you have a foundation on philosophy. So you have philosophers in the past that had that same idea. They combined law and economics because you know that knowledge. It's not like a drawer, that a cabinet that you have drawers. Economics, psychology, law, sociology. That's the way we divide it for pedagogical, educational purposes. But everything converges to the object, human being, men. And everything has to do with men. It's interdisciplinary. Economics is interdisciplinary. Law is interdisciplinary. We just change the way we understand each science. Like economics is the study of choices in a reality of scarcity. Law, you study norms and rules that provide peace to a society, whatever you want to say, but everything has to do with the object man. So I can give you a list of predecessors, people that talked about this, but the most famous ones that I find charming is the fact that we didn't even know economics would exist. And they talked about law and economics the way we talk about it today. They wanted to make sense. They wanted something useful. They want to keep an eye on consequences. And that's what economics does. We ask questions, is this going to lead to that result? We analyze that considering reality. And what is reality? People. People make decisions basically because of their incentives. This is the way we are. We tend to be rational. Some of us are cuckoo, not rational, but we tend to be rational. We make mistakes once, twice, 3 times, then we tend to correct, or we fall out of the market, or we get married, remarried, and then we try to make it right the 3rd time. And that's the way we do. We tend to be rational. And microeconomics has never been rebutted. So Beccaria, his name was Bonesana, right? Marchese di Beccaria was an Italian. And he came with that idea. He said, you guys, punishment, it has to have a purpose. So we should choose the punishment according to social harm. And then it's hard to calculate that. So he used big numbers and happiness. And he was against death penalty and mistreatment of prisoners, which was great. People think that economics is very mean. People want to kill people. It's all about money, and it's not. You have limits. It's just a goal. It's just a practical thing. And I learned in Congress. I learned as an academic. I learned as a lawyer. I learned as an economist all my life, and I retired from Congress. I'm still a professor. And my experience with law and economics, that we look at situations and we give advice based on questions and on goals and understanding the stakeholders, the agents involved, and the incentives that each one has. You know, this is becoming scientific. We use game theory. So it's not like, what is 2 + 2? You ask a common lawyer, he would say, if you want, I can make it 3 or 5. We don't want that. We want to say it tends to be 4 because of this and that. Now you decide what you want to do. So I learned that I'm a technician. I'm not a politician. I tell them this may work and work for you to reach this goal. If you want to do that and base it on morality or any other methodology, it's a totally different epistemological look or view or dimension. We don't mix morality, ideology with law and economics, which is a tool. So it makes sense. Another, Jeremy Bentham, we use him a lot in economic analysis of crime. So he says, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measurement of right or wrong. He was trying to bring logic, okay? And this little book here, this Adam Smith, he was talking about law. He's the father of economics as we know this field today, but he was talking about law and he was talking about economics because they're together. It's just a practical view. And law, people decide based on whatever they want, their morality, their judgments. But if they look at what it is and the advice of economists, they can make better decisions. Oliver Holmes, right? This little book, this is a tiny book. I was reading it and I got these little parts of it, which I love this guy. You know, this was a justice of the United States at the beginning of the last century. And this guy was so right on. All lawyers should seek to understand economics. With your help, you can learn to consider, weigh the legislative ends, means of achieving them, and then the cost involved. We learn how to get something. You have to give up something. So you have opportunity cost. You have trade-offs. You make choices. I worked with budget. I had a budget cap. I had to make choices. If you spend on this, you have to give up that. That's what you have to do because we have to make choices. So for the rational study of the law of the black letter man, may be the man of the present, but the man of the future, the man of statistics, and the master of economics. This is in the book. I just got it. This book is tiny, but this guy, Brandeis, a lawyer who has not studied economics and sociology, which is also about men, is very apt to become a public enemy. Why is that? Because hell is paved with good intentions. I don't care about intentions. That goes to morality. I don't waste my time thinking about that. I look at what is the problem? How much does it cost? Do we have alternatives? What should the government intervene or not? So what do we want? Okay, and this is like, it reveals a lot of people who are hypocrites that say that they want A, but they want B, but that's not our problem. That's the problem of the people who decide, right? So how did the contemporary law and economics start? It started very recently. I'm very young. It was about my age. Well, anyway, Henry Simons was an economist, and he was appointed to be dean of the Chicago Law School. Lawyers didn't want to be dean. It was too much of a management problem, so they put an economist. That was the birth, because he indicated Aaron Director that did not like to write, but he was so smart. He had that economist mindset of questions. So he would question every paper that those professors of the law school would write. What do you want with this? What is your goal? So you're talking about people that have this incentive and you think they're going to go in this direction. It's not going to work. So he brought a scientific insight. And you guess what? Economics was open to other areas of knowledge, like engineering, like math, right? With Keynes, at the beginning of the century, you have concepts like efficiency and productivity, and economics was open to that. Law wasn't. Law is that traditional closed area. So economics became science. Yay. It got lots of Nobel Prize winners, but it can help. And we're not talking about law and economics or economic analysis of law. We're talking about law and consequences. We're talking about an area that brings all of the science to say, law, you've got a lot of important decisions to make. We need to back you up with science so you can make better decisions. So Aaron Director did that. And he, with a guy that was very young called Ronald Coase, they started a journal of law and economics in 1958. Actually, he was friends with Hayek, and he's Austrian for birth, and his brother-in-law was Milton Friedman. Okay, so Ronald Coase wrote it's like 18 pages long, Problem of Social Cost, and he changed the mindset of a group of economists and law professors of the university. And he published this. And this is according to Posner. He's a circuit judge of the United States. I think it's the Ninth Circuit. And he's one of the founding fathers of law and economics. He said it was the most important development. So just for you to understand, 1960s, problem of social costs, Ronald Coates, Guido Calabresi, the cost of accidents, with Richard Posner writing his first book. Now it's in the, I think, 9th edition, and he changed a lot. And then 1980s, you have Henry Manny, that was my dear friend. He was my dear friend, 2015, and he passed away, unfortunately. And they invited judges of the United States, 70% to go to resorts, like to go to hotels and have fun for the weekend and listen a little bit of law and economics. And it made sense. They started applying. It was easier. I don't know what to do. This is a dilemma, moral dilemma. Let me look at law and economics. Oh, it says that this will reach its goal, so I'm going to choose this. They started using it in practice. So it's not theory. It's like to use in practice. It's a tool. It's a tool, right? So 1990s, the world started having associations, universities having institute. 1988, University of Tel Aviv, I was a fellow there. Ariel Porach, the president, he's a law and economics scholar. You go to Haifa, Arion Gazal, he's a law and economics fellow. You go to the Hebrew University, the guys, the deans are all in law and economics, or they know law and economics because it's a wonderful tool, right? So it's the 20th century most important influential legal academic discipline, for sure. And this is my dear friend, Henry Manny, wonderful guy, loved bird watching, loved to play golf, was a great fellow, but his influence is very important. Why? Because he spread the word. He made people that work with the institutions use it. Just like in Congress, I saw this change in Brazil. And believe me or not, these guys came to Brazil in 2007. We had this huge conference at the Supreme Court, in the legislative, and we got together all of the scattered law and economics scholars, and we created the Brazilian Law and Economics Association. Today, it just had its 14th annual conference with scholars from all universities. And it's on trend. It's the fashion here. Ministers, justices of the Supreme Court write books. Economic analysis of procedural law. It's like the elite here in Brazil. People love law and economics. And my fear is that people sometimes don't use it right, but everybody's using it. So I'm very happy. Posner says the idea of applying economics to law is not new. I just showed you the predecessors. What's new is the variety of problems in the field which economics is applied to, right? So I just wrote this to say that we're bringing law to a scientific level. Economics is scientific. We've never had a Nobel Prize laureate in law, only for peace, right? But for economics, for people coming from political science like Eleanor Armstrong, from psychology and behavioral economics, several areas, studying human decisions, human behavior. And this is what we need to know, because they are our objects of all of the public policies, of decisions, and they're the reason why rules and norms are made, right? So I met Bruce Ackerman in Rio in one of the Alacde conference, and he was like, he's very into legal philosophy, and he's not let's say libertarian in ideology, but he was like, yeah, it's the most important development of academic law next to legal philosophy. He was insisting over a wine. But what I want to say is that I have worked with people that consider themselves leftist. I am rightist. I'm more to the right. Who cares what team I go for? What we want is the technician. It's like, I don't know, in Ecuador, the soccer teams, but you have two adversary soccer teams, but you know that the technique in soccer, who plays better. Everybody discusses that. That's all we care. I don't care what team, what emotional team you go for. So I had colleagues in Congress that were leftists, and we got together and we said, what is the goal? What do we want? Reduce poverty, or create this or that, or improve, reduce negative externality, or this or that. How much do we have? Do we have alternatives? We've got to be friends. We could work together because it's a tool. We do not make decisions. So in Brazil, we had in 2007 Alacde. This made a whole lot of difference. So it became, then we created the Brazilian Law and Economics Association that year, and this has spread. And this is what Robert Cooter, my mentor, my professor, the person who I first learned about law and economics, I didn't know that existed. He said, it's just like rabbits in Australia. It makes sense. Okay, so law and economics, contemporary, right? The way it is now, it's a tool, a new methodology that we try to understand law. We look at, it should be called Law and Consequences, because it uses psychology, sociology, everything, even math, game theory, everything that helps, gives you subsidies, information, tool to decide. Okay, so it analyzes rules, results, institutions. It's not about money. Students get like, they think economics is about money and you want to make money and profit. Nothing to do. Totally wrong. It's not about currency. It's about behavior and choices. It's an evaluation of effectiveness of legal rules, including but not limited the efficient use of resources. The word efficiency is a little detail part of it. It's not the big thing, big goal. And efficiency, you have to be effective, efficiency in terms of money, and the social interest, which is efetividade in Portuguese. Okay, so you analyze cost benefit. Gary Becker, one of the economists of the century, so he gave a lot of information to how many resources and punishment should be used to enforce different kinds of legislations, a lot of input, a lot of content, science to economic analysis of crime. So we're helping law to be a science after all. Finally, judges move slower than markets. So judges, they have to decide, markets are fast, right? That's the problem. Judges make decision, public policy maker makes decision, government intervenes, and they're faster, but then the markets react, right? Because things, the goal are people, right? So what I want to say is that the way that I learned how to think during my first course, economics, I worked with governmental banking, is that sanctions are prices. They work as prices. So this is the way I thought. Every time I went to class in law school, I would ask the professor, hey, why is that law like that? What is the goal? It's not achieving its goal. And they said, oh, it's the will of the legislator. Baloney. It's not, believe me. I worked in Congress. It's a mess, a total mess. But that's why we want to bring tools to help these law not create more transaction costs and problems, and help public policy makers reach goals that are more efficient or that are more compatible to their goals. So we can say, hey, this is the law and it's creating this problem, okay? So we can maybe make predictions if this bill, this project will become law, it might create this. Maybe we could say, even go further and be a little bit more arrogant or a little bit more audacious and say, it provides technical recommendation. Look, you might do this and that. Who knows, it might work, right? And we use a lot of cost benefit analysis. Remember, cost, maybe social cost. Sometimes it's very difficult to put in numbers, okay? Very difficult. So we have to test and compare. I love the United States. You know why? Because it's you have a lot of states. It's a laboratory. You have consumer laws, corporate laws, criminal laws that are different. And then you can compare which has the best, let's say, corporate law. Delaware. You can compare, and you can have Akerlof writing his paper on lemons, market for lemons, and winning getting the Nobel Prize for that. You can improve legislation, because just like he said, a law is not one idea, it's a process, just like science, it's a process. So my friend, my mentor, my dear friend, Robert Cooter, I really want to pay tribute to him because of his influence, his interest in Latin America and spreading the word here. And so and the fact that he always said law and consequences, it should be called law and consequences. Here in Brazil, in the judiciary, judges use it. Sometimes they're in a crossroad, like Minister Justice Ellen Gracie from the Supreme Court on stem cells. The law says, throw all the embryos, stash them, throw them away, because they went beyond 5 years. Okay, that's their expiration date. And then all of these religious groups said, no, you have to pro-life. And she said, no, let's use it for science. So they said, let's do the cost benefit analysis. I'm not going to get into the morality because it's too confusing. I'm going to be very rational. And she approved it in the Supreme Court, saying, I'm going to use these stem cells. This law is not unconstitutional. It's not, because it uses stem cells for science. Decisions like this is using with the word law and economics. Totally. Claudia Cristina Cristofani, here in Brazil, lots of judges are becoming judges that are famous because they use law and economic tools. They're not less just, less fair, less efficient. They're more. They're concerned about reaching a goal, a result. And so she did not approve. She dismissed injunction of a citizen that wanted the municipal health department to pay his drugs for an immune system problem or arthritis. And she said, if they pay you what you want, they're going to go bankrupt. And I cannot take, so she brought the fact that you have to look at the greater picture, you have to look at the forest and not the tree, and you have to keep an eye on the consequences. This is one of several here in Brazil. We have a lot to improve in our country, I can tell you that, but we're trying to do it. So this is it. Thank you so much. And my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Flavia. It was really insightful. And you were talking about my university. So I must say I'm one of, not Henry Manis, but Henry Butler's disciples from George Mason and the judges program there. So it was really wonderful.
That's so great. Antonio Scalia was a dear friend, and Henry Butler is a dear friend too. He's the dean, right? But Henry Manny has his name in the law and economics.
Yeah. He's still running it. Okay, so Are you there, my dear Ruben?
Yes, I am here, so I think you can see me. I'm going to speak in Spanish to present the next speaker. Muchas gracias, profesora Flavia. Excelentes palabras. Vale recordarle a la asistencia y a la audiencia que nos está siguiendo por YouTube que cada expositor o expositora presente ideas a título personal y que nosotros como instituciones no necesariamente vamos a estar en esa línea. Dicho esto, el siguiente expositor es el profesor Michael Gilbert, quien actualmente se desempeña como vicedecano de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Virginia. Asimismo, como director del Centro de Derecho Público y Política y Economía Política. El profesor Gilbert ha tenido a su cargo asignaturas que tienen que ver con el derecho electoral, con la formulación de legislación, con derecho y economía, y actualmente sus investigaciones se enfocan en lo que es financiamiento de campañas políticas, corrupción y cultura de guerra. El profesor Gilbert ha participado en múltiples proyectos en Asia, en Latinoamérica. De hecho, ha sido autor de un artículo en la revista de la Facultad de Jurisprudencia y de coautor con el profesor Robert Hutter de un artículo sobre Constitutional Law and Economics que acabamos de traducir para el número 10 que se acaba de lanzar de la revista citada. Profesor Gilbert, Michael, thank you very much for being here with us. So just let's start.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruben. I appreciate the introduction and I'm happy to have a chance to join you all and to talk to you today. Is it possible for me to share my screen?
Sure, just give me a second, please.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I'll put some slides up. Let me say again, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to address you all. I recognize some names in the participant screen, but others of you are new to me and we haven't crossed paths, and I'm happy to meet you all. My plan was to talk for about maybe 20 or 25 minutes today. I'm not sure if we have that much time. Ruben, tell me if we're short on time, but I can shorten my presentation. And if there's time afterwards, I'm happy to take questions.
No, please, just go ahead. You got 25 minutes. Yeah, we can take that time. No worries, that's fine.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And if there's time afterwards, I'm happy to try to answer questions. And of course, I'll give you my email address at the end. I'm happy to connect with people offline as well. So Ruben told me that I could choose a topic that I find interesting in contemporary law and economics. And I've decided to talk today about enforcement. How do we get people to comply with the law? And many of you know this intellectual history. The economic analysis of enforcement really began in 1968. That's when a very famous economist, Gary Becker, published his paper, Crime and Punishment, an Economic Approach. Even if you're not familiar with Becker's name, you almost certainly know some of his ideas. And I won't review all of the ideas here, but I'll just talk very briefly about the framework he set out. And it's the core economic framework for thinking about deterrence and compliance with the law. And unsurprisingly for an economist, Becker started by saying people are rational. And that means that when they consider complying with or violating the law, they weigh their costs and benefits. And the benefits from violating the law might include things like the profit from the crime. If I steal the car and the car's worth $10,000, then the benefit to me of the crime is $10,000. And they weigh those benefits against the expected costs, which are the punishments. What is the probability of me getting caught? If I'm caught, what's the probability of me being convicted? If I'm convicted, what is the punishment in terms of fines and imprisonment and so on? And Becker's prescription, there are lots of details I'm skipping over, but in brief, the prescription was you have to make the expected punishment greater than the benefit. And if you do that, people will comply with the law. Now, in a way, 50, 60 years later, this analysis, though very important, seems simple. It is simple, but it's foundational. It has influenced a great deal of important work on enforcement. It does make some very important assumptions. And one especially important assumption is that people have good information. that when people decide how to act, they know what the law permits them to do, they know what the law forbids, they know their probability of getting caught, they know their probability of being convicted. If they're convicted, they know what the punishment will be. Most people, most of the time, do not have that information. Lawyers don't have that information. I'm a lawyer, most or all of you are lawyers, and we all know that we do not know all of the law all of the time. And even when we know the law, we almost never know our exact probability of getting caught if we break the law. It's hard to even estimate that probability. Okay, so in the last several years, a whole variety of scholars have gotten interested in this question or this issue right at the intersection of compliance and information. And that's what I want to talk about. Now, I just want to pause for a moment because I see in the chat a question. Can people hear me?
Yeah. I was wondering if you were presenting something because we can't see it.
So I have not shared my screen, but you can. Yeah,
No, you didn't, but you have permission for doing so.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sharing my screen right now. Do you see that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. I was just holding off on, there's nothing to see yet. So I was waiting until I made my introductory remarks. Okay, so what I want to talk about for a little while today is this issue, the intersection of information and compliance. What do people know? What don't they know? And how does our information affect enforcement? And there are lots of things to say here. I'm going to concentrate on a few sets of ideas that I find especially interesting. And the third idea is something I'm working on. I hope you won't mind if I talk briefly about my work at the end. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is the idea that law itself can supply people with information. And some of you might be familiar with the work I'm going to refer to. Others of you, I see at least some nods. Others of you might not. I won't, in any case, talk about it for very long. The idea I'm talking about here has been pushed by other people, but it comes principally from Richard McAdams, who's a law professor at the University of Chicago. And the idea is this: law can influence people's beliefs. And by influencing people's beliefs, it can change people's behavior, even if there's no threat of getting caught, even if there's no punishment for violating law. Just by sharing information, it can change what we do. Now, this idea is easier to explain with a very simple example. So suppose you find yourself on a lovely beach, and the sand is white, and the sky is blue, and the weather is warm, and the palm trees are lovely, and you're thinking about getting in the water to swim, and then you see this sign. Do you get in the water? Now, let's just assume that if you get in the water, the probability of getting punished is 0. The beach is deserted. There is no officer nearby to ticket you for violating City Code Section 602. So we are not in Becker's world. The probability of punishment is 0, so the expected punishment is 0. Nevertheless, many people would see this sign and they would decide not to get in the water. Why? It's because the law has taught you something you didn't know before. And consequently, in economics language, it has caused you to update your beliefs, and those new beliefs change your behavior. So what has the law taught you here? It's taught you that the water's dangerous. You didn't know that before. And the law tells you that, and that affects your behavior. So merely by providing information to people, law can change their behavior for the better. Now, for law to work this way, some conditions have to be satisfied. There are probably a number of conditions, including some technical ones. I'm going to focus here on, I think, especially important and intuitive conditions. All right. There we go. They've shown up now. So first of all, for law to inform you, you must know about the law. And that's not surprising. In my example, if you did not read the city code, most people don't, and if you didn't see the sign on the beach, you wouldn't know that the law doesn't let you swim here. Okay, you have to know the law for it to provide you with information. The second two conditions are more interesting. First of all, the person reading or seeing the law, in this example, the sign, they have to assume that the lawmaker has relevant private information. In this example, the lawmakers who drafted that city code, they know something about the safety of the water that I do not know. And then the third condition is, well, you have to assume that the law reveals that private information. And that condition's, in a sense, the most important and the least obvious one. So if I see that sign on the beach, and I think the lawmakers must know more about the water than I do, so conditions 1 and 2 are satisfied, that's still not enough, right? I might think something like the following. I might think, well, if I don't swim here, I have to go to the rich hotel next door and pay them to use their beach. And the rich hotel probably controls the city council. And so the city council probably made up this law, not because the water's unsafe, but because they're trying to push people to the rich hotel. Well, if that's the way I reason, that's a way of saying that even though those lawmakers have private information, they know more than I do about the safety of the water. This law doesn't reveal that information. This law is about something else. It's about the interests of the hotel. Okay, so all 3 of those conditions have to be satisfied for law to change people's beliefs and thus change their behavior. And I think, although in a sense, McAdams' point is obvious, it's only obvious when you think about it. Becker didn't say anything about this. And many other economists who've written persuasively about enforcement have said little or nothing about this. And the phenomenon could arise in a whole variety of situations. So just to give 2 more examples, if you drive and if you see a double yellow line, that's telling you that changing lanes here is prohibited. Most people don't change lanes over a double yellow line. Is it because they're likely to get a ticket? Probably not. It's because the lines are telling them passing here is not safe. And the people who put these lines down on the road know more than I do, and the lines are conveying that information. You can think of lots of traffic regulations in this spirit. You can think of other regulations in this spirit too. But in the interest of time, let me move on to a second study on this issue of information and enforcement. And the next study I want to tell you about, let's see if I can get it to show up there, is about not about the law itself providing you with information, but about the enforcement of the law providing you with information. And in particular, I want to focus on a paper by Bert Huang that I think is especially interesting. Bert is a law professor and an economist at Columbia. Some of you might know him or be familiar with his research. So here's the basic idea. If you observe enforcement against others, and if you know all of the law and all of the facts, then observing that enforcement can teach you a lot. So let's just take a couple of examples. Suppose that the law says no smoking in the park. And let's suppose that I know that law. And let's suppose that I see you smoking. And let's suppose that I think enforcement here is 0. You're not supposed to smoke in the park. It's illegal, but the police don't waste their time giving people tickets for smoking in the park. They're doing other things. So I assume the probability of enforcement is 0. But then I see a person smoking in the park get a ticket. And I know they're getting a ticket for smoking. Well, now I've learned something from the enforcement. Before, I thought the probability of enforcement of this law was 0, and now I know it's higher than 0. I don't know if it's 10% or 50%. It's got to be greater than 0. I've learned something. And I've learned it because I know the law and the facts. I know the law, I know the facts. You're smoking in the park. That's a violation of the law. Okay. Just one more quick example. Let's suppose I think the rule, I know the law says no fireworks, and I assume that the police enforce that law. But then I see you lighting fireworks, and I see the police walk by you without giving you a ticket. Okay, if I know the law, fireworks are illegal, no exceptions. And if I know the facts, you're definitely lighting fireworks, then non-enforcement tells me something. I thought the probability of enforcement was 100%, but it's not, it's lower than that. I don't know what it is, but it's lower than that. Maybe it's 0. Okay, that's the kind of Beckerian world. Right? You have lots of good information. And when you do, you can learn something from observing enforcement. Now let's talk about a different kind of situation. This is the one that this paper I'm referring to focuses on. If you don't know the law or the facts or both, then enforcement can mislead you. you don't learn much. In fact, you update your beliefs in problematic ways, you make errors. So let me give you the example that Bert in his paper starts with, and that's based on his experience in real life. So suppose that the law says no alcohol in the park. And you're standing in the park and you have a bottle of wine and you would like to drink that bottle of wine. But you see the sign and it says no alcohol in the park. And now here's the important step. You see other people right there drinking wine. And they're not getting in trouble. The police see them, but nobody's getting a ticket for drinking wine. Okay, so you think the probability of enforcement is 0. It's illegal, but the police don't enforce it. They can drink wine, I can too. You open your bottle of wine and you immediately get a ticket. What's the problem? Well, the people who you see drinking wine, who are not getting in trouble, they're not actually in the park. They're in the yard of a restaurant next to the park. It looks like the park, but it isn't. It's private property, and this law doesn't apply there. So they can drink, but you can't. Let me give you just one more example to motivate the idea. You're standing outside of a football or a soccer match, and the sign says, no ticket sales. That's the law. Okay, so the stadium can sell you a ticket, but you can't scalp your ticket. If you have an extra, you're not allowed to sell it. Okay, now you see people standing in the crowd saying, I have an extra ticket, who wants to buy it? And so you think, well, the law says no ticket sales, but I see people selling their tickets and they're not getting in trouble. I have an extra ticket, I can sell my ticket too. So you try to do it, and what happens? You immediately get in trouble. The police stop you and they issue a fine. Why? Well, here's why. The law isn't really no ticket sales, although that's what the sign might say. The law is no ticket sales without a license. And the people you see selling their tickets in the crowd, they are all licensed ticket sellers, but you didn't know that because they look like you and they're dressed like you. Okay, so these are 2 examples where you observe enforcement, but it doesn't teach you things. It causes you to update your beliefs in the wrong way. You make errors. And the root problem is that you don't know the law, or you don't know the facts, or both. I don't know the boundaries of the park. I don't know the exception for licensed resellers, and so on. Now, this leads to lots of interesting implications, I think. One of which is, if you're the state and you want people to update their beliefs correctly, then you don't want to post signs like the ones I have put on my slide. It is in the state's interest to alert people to the fact that you don't know the law, or you don't know the facts, or both. And so you should be careful about your updating. So let me just give you some examples here. Instead of posting a sign that says no alcohol in the park, the state should post a sign that says alcohol on private property only. Because if you don't know the facts and you don't know the law, but you see that sign, you might think twice. I see that they're drinking wine and they're not getting in trouble, but that doesn't mean I can do it. Maybe they're on private property and I'm not. It makes you careful. It makes you check before you update your beliefs. Likewise, good law posts a sign, not that says no ticket sales, but that says something like ticket sales by authorized resellers only. Because once again, this kind of sign alerts you to the fact that you don't actually know the law, or you don't know the facts, and so you need to be careful when updating your beliefs. Okay, let me talk now about a third and final project at this intersection of enforcement and information. And I hope you'll indulge me. This is a paper that I'm involved in. And it's once again on the connection between enforcement and learning. If I see the law enforced against others, what can I learn about the probability of enforcement against me? Now, in the last paper, or the last research project that I described to you, it was sort of assumed that the state wants you to update your beliefs correctly. They want you to know and to learn about the risk of enforcement. They want you to know that that's private property and you can't drink in the park. You have to be on the restaurant's property or whatever. Now, this is a project that sort of takes the opposite perspective. So this project is focused on a kind of scenario and a form of law in which the government can hide its enforcement capacity. It doesn't want you to update, because if you do update, you will realize the government is weak and you can get away with a lot. So that's the kind of general spirit of the project. And let me start with a piece of conventional wisdom. This is conventional wisdom about the old trade-off between rules and standards. All right, there we go. Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the old distinction between rules and standard, right? Law that's formed as a rule is precise, whereas law that's formulated as a standard is imprecise. Right? We're not quite sure what it requires. There's some discretion in the application of a standard. And here's a piece of conventional wisdom. It is cheaper for the government to enforce rules than to enforce standards. And the intuition is very simple. With a rule, you don't have to inquire into extenuating circumstances. If the speed limit is 55 and you got caught going 85, you broke the rule and that's that. Nobody has to stop and ask, well, was there someone in labor in your car, or did you have a different medical emergency? Or we're not interested in those questions with a rule. Whereas with a standard, you might have to ask those questions. You were going very fast, but did you have a reason for that? Did you have a medical emergency? Okay, so the conventional wisdom is that enforcing rules is cheaper than enforcing standards. Now, the point of this paper is to develop the kind of converse or opposite point. Okay. Failing to enforce a rule is costlier than failing to enforce a standard. And that's because when you fail to enforce a rule, you reveal more information about your limited enforcement capacity. Now, I think this idea will get much clearer, as usual, with an example. So let me talk you through a very simple example, but I think it does a good job of conveying the information. So let's just use a speed limit example. I like speed limits because everybody understands them. Everybody drives. Everybody's used to this dynamic. Okay, so suppose that the speed limit is 55. Because enforcement is expensive, the government will not pull anybody over. It will not enforce the speed limit unless you go 66 or faster. The government knows that. But we don't know that. Drivers don't know exactly when the state's going to enforce and when it isn't. Now, suppose that you're driver B, maybe you're new to town, and you're trying to decide how fast you can go without getting a ticket. And you don't know the government's enforcement capacity. You know the law is 55, but you don't know when the government will decide to stop you. Now you see another driver, A, go by at 65 with impunity. They don't get in trouble. They drive 65 right in front of a police car and don't get pulled over. What do you learn from this fact? Well, you learn that you can drive 65 too. The law says 55, no exceptions. A can get away with 65. I must be able to get away with 65 too. So you go 65. And here's the general point. Non-enforcement in this example implies that the state has limited enforcement capacity. There's no question that driver A broke the law, but driver A is not getting in trouble. So the only or the most natural explanation is that the state has limited enforcement capacity. And that means that I, driver B, I can speed too. Now, let's rerun our scenario, but instead of imagining the speed limit as a rule, let's imagine it as a standard. So I'm in the United States, I grew up in a big state near Canada called Montana. It's a big state, but very few people. And for a while in Montana, I kid you not, the speed limit was reasonable and prudent speeds. It was a standard. Basically, drive reasonably. That didn't go so well, but not for reasons related to my project. So let's just run with this example. Let's suppose that the speed limit is a standard. It just says reasonable speeds. Now, in fact, the government will not enforce the speed limit against anyone unless they're going 66 or faster. But we don't know that. Only the government knows that. Now, once again, we take the perspective of driver B. Maybe driver B is new to town, trying to figure out how fast he can go without getting in trouble. Driver B sees driver A go 65 right in front of a police officer and not get a ticket. Okay, what does driver B do? Well, driver B might say, A can go 65, I'm going to go 65 too. Or driver B might reach a different conclusion. B might say, actually, I should slow down. I can't go 65. Why? Well, it's because when we craft the law as a standard, driver B learns less. It could be that A is not getting a ticket because the state has limited enforcement capacity, in which case B can go 65 too. Or it could be that A has some extenuating circumstance that makes it reasonable for A to go 65, but not for B, because B doesn't have that same circumstance. So there's hopefully that point is clear. I'm going to generalize it in just a moment. There's a connection between the ideas in this paper and the ideas from Bert Huang that I talked about just a few minutes ago. So remember, when you know the law and you know the facts, you can learn something from observing enforcement. When you don't know the law and you don't know the facts, or both, right, then enforcement is harder to understand. It's harder to update your beliefs. Well, these examples are capturing that and illustrating or exploring the idea in the context of rules and standards. It's easier to know the law with a rule because you don't need to know exceptions. You don't need to know how the enforcer will exercise his or her discretion. It's harder to know the law with a standard because you don't know the extenuating circumstances. You don't know how the enforcer will exercise discretion. And that makes it harder for you to update your beliefs. Now, in the scenario we study, the state might like that. They don't want you to update your beliefs because if you do, you will realize that the state is weak. Now, let me just draw a few more. I'll stop very shortly, but just a few more points to cover. So for the standard to work, or for the general idea I've explored to function in the way I've described, a few conditions have to be satisfied. So the first one is that extenuating circumstances have to excuse otherwise unlawful behavior. So driver A goes 65, that's okay if driver A has a medical emergency. It's not okay if driver A is racing to the bar to meet his friends. Right? Extenuating circumstances can excuse the behavior. The second condition is you, in our example, driver B, you have to observe enforcement or non-enforcement in other cases. And then the third really important condition is that it's got to be harder for you to determine if those cases have extenuating circumstances than for the state. So the idea is the thing that might cause driver B to slow down is the fear that the state knows something about driver A that B doesn't. The state knows that driver A has a medical emergency, or the state knows that driver A is actually taking, I don't know, the president of Ecuador to the airport or something, right? The state knows something that driver B doesn't. Okay, so just one last few points of discussion on this project. I started with the conventional wisdom. Enforcing a rule is cheaper than enforcing a standard, but it turns out, I believe, my co-authors believe, there's an opposite point here that hasn't been explored and that we think is quite interesting. Failing to enforce a rule is actually costlier than failing to enforce a standard, because failing to enforce a rule sends clearer signals about your limited enforcement capacity. So the second bullet is the same idea, just expressed in a different but maybe helpful way. The generality and predictability of rules, exactly their features that make them cheap to enforce, also makes the failure to enforce them informative. If the state didn't enforce, it's not because there's some exception, it's not because there's some discretion, it must be because the capacity is weak. And then this leads to the last, maybe natural point. If you're an enforcer or a state with limited capacity, this could include courts formulating doctrine, you might have a strategic reason to prefer standards to rules. And the strategic reason is sometimes those standards can mask your limited enforcement capacity. Okay, I hope you found at least some of that interesting. I think these topics are very interesting, and hopefully they connected to each other in a more or less logical way. My email address is on your slide if anyone wants to be in touch after the presentation. I don't know, Ruben, what comes next, but I'm happy to stick around if there are questions or whatever else. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gilbert, Michael, for being with us today. And no, this one was the last session. This one was the clausura, as we say in Spanish. And we really appreciate, that you take some of your time. You're a very busy person. We shared with us today. And this is the clausura. And if you let me say it in Spanish, muchas gracias a todas y todos los presentes por la participación el día de hoy. Con la presentación del profesor Gilbert se cierra este ciclo de conferencias coorganizado, como indicamos al principio, entre la Universidad Católica del Ecuador, la Universidad Externa de Colombia y Alacde. A todas las participantes y participantes, pues se les va a hacer llegar un enlace para una evaluación, y que es una condición necesaria que ustedes tienen que pasar para poder acceder al certificado del evento. So, thank you very much, Professor Gilbert, for your time. I'm sorry if I say it in Spanish, but I needed, to have this very clear to the audience. They have to present an exam, to see an exam. That's something that no one's like, but it has to be done for the certification. So, thank you very much for your presentation. It was an excellent presentation, and like you did in the past. I don't know what else to say, my dear Juan Martin. Do you want to add something else?
No, I just want to thank Professor Gilbert, and I'm looking forward to read this last work, because I believe information is one of the, in law and economics, is one of the main issues. How people get informed. I have a half-born child, as I like to say, with some imperfect information issues regarding the law. So it would be really, really helpful to read something like that, and really insightful. So thank you very much for sharing this with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, we are, we had an honor to have two great speakers today. Thank you very much, Flavia, for being with us too. Flavia just explained, why law and economics is important. She has her own particular point of view, but I think she defends her ideas pretty well. And Professor Gilbert, he performs an excellent academic presentation as well. So, muchas gracias a todas y a todos. Nos mantenemos en contacto. Hasta la próxima.
Chao, gracias.